So yeah, I thought we'd start off by talking about your ascent to where you are today, from back in Rimouski.
Yeah, I was born in Rimouski.
To today. Yeah.
Right, I can't use that as a password reset hint anymore. I always say that. My father was a programmer in the 60s, 70s, so I fell into programming sort of naturally. We always had computers at our house. We had those dot matrix printers, right? So I'm 45, it sets you in time, grew up in the 70s, the 80s, and actually never formally studied software engineering or computer science. I was always more interested by communications and computer as tools to communicate, right? Instead of being just focused on a technology, I always thought that technology was a way to accomplish something else, and I'm still to this day, right? So went to Cégep de Valleyfield, and I was working on I was in a lot of the student associations, and we understood that we needed to control the media in the Cégep to have a strong position as an association. So I was in the part of the radio committee, and we started a journal, right? If you want to do propaganda right, you have to own the presses. But kidding aside, I discovered that there was there's a room in the basement somewhere with 4 Macintosh, with Photoshop, Quark Express, scanners, and that you could actually run your own student paper from the resources that were there, including selling the ads, mostly to bars, right, if it's student paper, and which was a good thing to do. Like, you'd go sell the ads to the bar, and you'd write the stories, and you'd go see, at that time, it was like a Metallica and Guns N' Roses show, and wrote about that in the paper. And that was like my first discovery of how you can run a business based on technology. And then I wanted to go to a university, but not to do computer science, but at the time it was called multimedia, right? The forefront school for that was UQAM, but UQAM was not ready to launch their program in multimedia. So there was Concordia and UQAM, but at the time I wanted to attend university, which was 93-ish, 92, 93-ish. All you could do in schools was to enroll in computer science and do boring things like calculating numbers and accounting with computers. And I was more interested in the creative side of computing. And a bunch of professors from UQAM left the university to start a private school, which was a bit like a bootcamp-ish type of school, which was called ICARI, and all the people from the industry doing 3D graphics, motion design, computer assisted du montage, right? And this is how I got started with most of my teachers from the industry. So if you were any good, you'd get gigs, and I started as a freelancer, and this is how I discovered that I could be my own boss, right? If you're a freelancer, the real bosses are your clients, right? But not have a boss and be your own boss and be independent and start working on my own projects on the side, right? So this was not by design. It sort of happened because the school system was not ready and was not offering what I was looking for. I've since went back a little bit, and I have amazing relationships with all the universities in Montreal now, but never had this straight path as a student that would tell me, like, this is what you study and this is what you'll do in life. It was always a discovery process for me, right?
I think that's a common feeling that a lot of people in college have now, that, it's not necessarily preparing them for like life in the real world or something like that. Is this kind of how you felt?
Yes, it was this combination of, I think one gift my parents gave me was this idea of you can do what you love in life, right? Don't do what you have to do. Do what you love to do, and the rest will follow. And I've been trying to pass this along to my own kids, and to say, well, I mean, maybe you could have a great job, but if you hate this and you can't stand the teachers, you can't stand what you're actually studying, and you don't like it, I mean, life will be long and boring. Like, find something that you like, that you love, ideally, and the rest sort of follows. And we're lucky. I mean, I think this is a privilege that we have today, to be able to think like this and find our own way, our own path. And I guess the second thing is, I didn't wait for someone to tell me what to do. I was always more on a path of there's multiple facets to what you're going to do in life. You might learn about one here, you might learn about another one here, and so this is how I've been sort of like weaving my own path. And if you would have told me like only 5 years ago you'd be working in finance and be a VC, I wouldn't have believed you, right? And so this is a happy accident too.
Yeah, and I think that technology is also kind of a unique industry in the sense that you have a lot of self-taught developers, and you have a lot of people that are taking boot camps and they're entering the industry. And you don't need to have a specific degree necessarily. You can just showcase your work. And those lower barriers to entry results in, I think, a lot of interesting, diverse people breaking into the field.
Yeah, I think one of the best invention that came with the first web browsers that doesn't get enough recognition was the fact that there was a menu where you could say view source, right? And this is how I learned to program for the web, right? You would find a web page and like, oh, this is funky. They have like a color background. Oh, remember, this is like 94, 95. And you would just like say view source, and you could say, oh, this is the code, this is hexadecimal code, this is how it works. And then you could switch and go to what's Google, like Alta Vista or whatever, and say hexadecimal color code. And like, oh, this idea that you could learn by doing, and there was always this infinite library. You could always learn something by just searching it and finding it, and that has been transformative, much more than I think we recognize today, right? And it's still the case, right? You can, but then like this is the first step, and then I realized really quickly, well, you actually need people that know how to do these things. I learned Unix and Linux not by myself, because that's a bit harder, but by working with sysadmins that would make fun of me because I had a Macintosh. I'll say, I'll show you the real deal, kid. Solaris machine, made by Sun.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was first learning and being exposed to computers, it was through MySpace. And it was my first experience with like front-end development, styling MySpace pages in CSS. Fortunately, I've come a long way since then. But
yeah, you know, you can change the color of your post on Facebook now. This is a real innovation, right?
So I thought we'd talk about your experience at Twitter and why you left Canada to join Twitter in San Francisco.
Right. We'll make a medium-sized story of a long story, but long story short, I had been working on a startup in Montreal. I started in 2006, 2007. This was basically Foursquare and Yelp. Before Foursquare and Yelp existed, it was called Praised. And my co-founder Sébastien, and was coming from the Yellow Page industry. I had a tech background. Harry Wakefield, our third co-founder, was like the only pro blogger I knew. This guy was making a real decent salary just by blogging professionally. And we thought there was something at this intersection of social media, blogging, recommendation, directories. So we iterated, we worked on this for a few years, and then suddenly we realized with the rise of Twitter and Facebook, 2007, 8-ish, that we didn't have to build a directory. People were asking questions and answering those questions live. So my co-founder Seb told me, could we index everyone asking every question on Twitter at every moment and geolocate them? And I said, yes, I'll try. And I had an amazing team of developers, and we came up with this first version. So we were one of the first developers using the Twitter streaming API, and we were parsing 500 million tweets a day. And this got some attention at Twitter. You guys are tweeting about this. My phone is buzzing. So we got really early to get to know the platform team at Twitter, and we got recognized for the work we're doing, and we were organizing events for Twitter developers. And as our startup, for other reasons, for I guess financial reasons, we were way too early, so it didn't work out, it didn't pan out, and we decided to stop working on that company. We had tried to sell it to Twitter. We were too early, didn't work. And then we decided to leave the company. And I worked to my friend Ryan at Twitter, who was running platform. I said, Ryan, my project was called Medium at the time. It's not panning out. Just want to know, I don't know what's my next gig, but I want to keep working with you guys at Twitter. I think it's amazing. And he wrote back a few minutes after saying, you were the startup guy working with Twitter. We're looking for people at Twitter to work with startups. Would you be interested? And I didn't say no, right? So that's how in 2012, I started talking with Twitter and came to this conclusion that there was an opportunity there. I had some expertise that was pretty rare and unique, and there was a possibility to go work at Twitter. So this was a big conversation with my friends, with my family, because it required moving to San Francisco, which I had done once before. So it was my second time going to work abroad. But I thought, if there's one company that I want to work with as an employee, not as an entrepreneur, which was another shift, I think Twitter is the one, right? So I made that jump and joined Twitter in 2012. To work on what they call platform relations, working with the APIs, and every media publisher in the world that wanted to use the Twitter APIs.
It's interesting. Twitter puts out it's very similar to what we talked about last week with our guest, Katerina Rizzi, where you have a product like Breather or Twitter where you can really project, the user projects their like needs and desires onto that product and then shapes it around that.
Yes. Twitter was invented to complain about Twitter, right? And a bunch of other things like airlines, right? And it was funny because Twitter actually, the developer relations team at Twitter was still a small team. So it was, when I joined, there were a few hundred employees, and they were hiring entrepreneurs. Like everyone was pretty autonomous, and you had your own goals and you knew what you had to accomplish, but you picked your own path and you did it the way you thought you had to do it. And when I joined Twitter, Twitter was really bad at tweeting, right? Because the challenge with being a big company and having a public voice is maybe the CEO or the CTO can tweet, and every employee was tweeting on their own behalf. But how do you tweet as a part of Twitter without having PR and comms and legal breathing down your neck? So what we did, one thing that's super simple that I created was to create Twitter Dev, which was the developer relations handle for just talking to developers. And we were aware, but not fully aware, but actually all the other brands had developer relations accounts on Twitter, except Twitter. So my favorite tweet was when I tweeted that, hey, hello world, Twitter Dev is live, and then I got a reply from Google Dev, and they were like, hey, welcome to the neighborhood, you'll like it here. Like, okay.
Okay, so fast forwarding a little bit into the future, you're in San Francisco, arguably tech mecca of the world, and working at one of the major tech companies. and then you decide to come back to Montreal and Quebec. Why?
Well, I had no plan, right? I didn't set myself up with this will be a year or 2 or 3 or 5. I just said I'll go with it. We'll see how it goes. Joined in 2012, IPO in 2013. But in 2014, it started to feel like a big company, right? I joined with a few hundred employees. Now there's 3,500 employees. There's now 50 people in my department. When I joined, I was the sixth person. I now have a new boss that has a boss. It feels a little bit less entrepreneurial, but it's still an amazing company. And I'm thinking, what will get me back to Montreal? I have no clue. I have no idea. And I had known the co-founders of Real Ventures for a long time, actually, because when they started their initial fund, I almost got funded by them in 2007, but their fund was not ready. They were great guys. They were entrepreneurs. So I had stayed in touch. I was on the board of Notman House, the community project. I was also a mentor at FounderFuel, the accelerator that started in 2011. These are all the things I had wish had existed when I started my own thing in the mid-2000s. So it was great, and I knew the guys there, and they were raising a new fund, and they told me, we're looking for someone with a tech background and to take care of FounderFuel, the startup accelerator. So you have to be passionate about this, like coaching, mentoring, and sort of go on your own about it, because we don't have no time to take care of this, but it's super important. So what do you think about it? I was like, wow, if there's one thing that would bring me back to Montreal, it would be something like this, work on the ecosystem, enable other entrepreneurs. So it felt like the right job for me. It took about 6 months of back and forth and how and why to finally come back in summer of 2014 at Startup Fest to start this gig. So it's almost 3 years now, and I must say I love it. It's even better than I had thought initially, mostly because this network effect is real, right? So this, for me, the one thing that I have learned throughout my career is that there's nothing more powerful than your network. And if you're generous and genuine with your network, it will come back, right? I was going to say it will pay back, but it's not about the payback. It's about the output and where it can take you and where it can take everyone in the network. So, perfect storm.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems that Montreal continues to grow as a tech hub. Proximity to great schools, a reasonable cost of living, cool French Quebecois culture. What's your assessment of the startup scene currently, and where do you see it going?
Right. It's interesting because Startup Festival, which is every July, is sort of my watermark. So every year I can see what's happening, how many projects, how many entrepreneurs, how many amazing spaces like here are popping up all over the city. And my wife, who's a movie director, actually did a movie, a documentary a few years ago about the indie music scene in Montreal. And I thought it was pretty interesting because the parallels are really good, right? You're in this band, Godspeed You Black Emperor. No one knows you in Montreal except a few freaks. But you're known worldwide, and then you open Casa del Popolo because people need a place to play gigs. And then you open Breakla Studio because, people need a place to record. And then you have Constellation Records because, hey, you need to distribute your music. And just this indie spirit of let's bootstrap and build it as we need it seemed to be totally the Montreal way to do it. And at the same time, possible and easy. So we've been bootstrapping the startup ecosystem for the last 10 years, step after step. We need more co-working, let's find more co-working. We need more funding, let's find more funding. We need more entrepreneurs, they're there, let's find them, right? And so what was interesting this year, with the help of Credo, who's based here, we and the Osmo Foundation behind the Notman House, we had the first Montreal startup ecosystem report. Because we didn't have that answer, like how many startups, how many entrepreneurs, what's the economic impact of startups? And I was the guy who was getting asked these questions every year by journalists, and I had no good answers. I was like, let's find the answer. And what we discovered is that the impact is much bigger than we thought. It's like several hundred millions of dollars just around Montreal. And we're doing it again for Quebec next year. But this has been sort of like the iceberg, right? I always like to compare the startup ecosystem to the game ecosystem. So the game ecosystem in Montreal is super visible, right? You go up Saint Laurent Street, you get to Ubisoft, and you see this building. It's like, wow, it's like thousands of people working in there. And there's like 10 of these big companies with thousands of employees that make all these games that you know. The startup scene was more like 1,000 10 people companies, right? So it's not visible. And so I think making it more visible, understanding how it works, it's a bit harder, but it's a real ecosystem. If one shuts down, one of your 10 big studios shuts down, you take a major hit. If one startup shuts down, and there's one every day that shuts down, one or two more pops up. So it's much more resilient and durable, as we say in French, to have 1,000 startups than just 10 big studios. And I mean, gaming studios will continue to be big in Montreal, and it's a big part of what we have here, but this indie side, kind of like sort of punk attitude that goes with startup, I love that.
Yeah. It's I had to make sure the mic was still working. It's interesting because the gaming industry, it self-promotes. Anyone that's playing a video game, they start a game and it pops up. It'll be like Ubisoft Montreal or wherever. But startups don't really advertise to that like wide audience as much. Like to learn about startups, you have to be immersed in the various like tech hub websites and things like that. Do you have any that you'd recommend for Montreal that you think are doing a good job promoting the community?
Well, there's some, but they're often more known outside of Montreal. You were talking about Breather, right? Mm-hmm. The average Joe in Montreal doesn't know about Breather. Mm-hmm. Lightspeed, which runs the point of sale systems to tons of major brands and major retailers, not that well known in Montreal. So we haven't had that Shopify moment, right? We haven't had that one IPO or that huge exit. Yes, PasswordBox was acquired by Intel, and Intel Security now has offices in Montreal, but we haven't had that big IPO or big exit. I think the biggest we had in the past was Softimage, but that's in the 90s, right? That's a bit far, right? I think we're quite due to have something happen, and we now have the density, the energy, and I think the right networks to see one of those major tech companies pop up over the next few years. But Breather is still just like a few years in. So most of our promising tech companies are somewhere between 3 to 5 years old, and they've raised between a few millions to a few dozens of millions. But we have no unicorns, right? Maybe it will be a moose. I don't know if we'll have Canadian unicorns. I don't know.
Well, not yet, at least. There's still time.
There's still time.
And it seems like, at least based on what you're saying, that maybe in a couple years we'll see like a flurry of exits, hopefully.
Yes, and maybe just great sustainable businesses, right? Exits are one thing, but I mean, Lightspeed has been building it for like 10 years. We had luxury retreats acquired by Airbnb for rumor between 200 and 300 million, 11 years in the making, right? So that's one of my favorite quote from BizStone, actually from Twitter, is 10 years of perseverance and hard work will make you an overnight success, right?
So one last question before we open it up to the audience. I think it's safe to say that there are probably some aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience, and I was wondering if you had any advice for them on how to build their business.
Right. I think the most important skill that is not taught anywhere is benchmarking, right? So that's why I tell every founder, talk a lot about what you're building. I don't believe in a company being stealth and you build something in secret in a basement. You know, in Quebec, we don't have garage because in the winter it's too cold. So the garage, the Silicon Valley garage is the Quebec basement. So if you're working on your startup in your basement during the winter, when there's no light, get out of the house, talk to people, benchmark yourself, and then benchmark yourself against the best, right? I hated people. When I started advising other entrepreneurs about 10 years ago, people would come to me and say, I'll build a YouTube of Quebec. And I'm like, no. First, the YouTube of Quebec will be YouTube, right? Let's settle that. What's unique about you? What do you, why now? What do you have that you're uniquely positioned to build as something that is world-class, global, and you'll be the best in that one narrow thing, but you'll be the best in the world in that. So aim at really high ambition, but then if you benchmark yourself and you compare yourself to other startups, they're all terrible. They're all incomplete, imperfect organizations, like every organization that you can peek into. And so it's easy to say, I can do better than most, but it's really, really hard to be the best. And I think benchmarking yourself is so important. And do this openly, humbly, honestly with other entrepreneurs. And the second effect that comes with that is you become really generous, right? Because you need help. And I've been helped a lot by other entrepreneurs. And you realize, well, if you're like just 3 or 6 months, or this one thing you know that I don't know, maybe I know something that can be helpful for you, right? So it's not paying forward, it's like it's paying around, right? It's a giving around, giving and receiving as we grow a startup ecosystem. And that's been sort of I think it's the new label I want to affix to Montreal. It's been known as a creative city for a long time, but I'd love it, and I think it's true, I'd love for it to be recognized as a collaborative city. And I think people that come to Montreal recognize that, they can see it. How far will it take us? We'll see.
When I go back home to Los Angeles after the boot camp, I'll start promoting it.
Thank you.
I'll start letting people
We need
know.
ambassadors.
Yes, Montreal, the collaborative city.